This is my vivid near-death experience that I'll never forget. Some of this is me trying to piece together fragments of memory. It's not 100% accurate to what I experienced, but I'm doing my best to remember based on my notes. I've shared this story with friends and family numerous times, but this is my first time doing so publicly. I'm a pastor for a sizable congregation, so please excuse my theatrics. All right, here we go. I'll never forget the color of the sky. It wasn't just dark or cloudy. It was an angry, burning orange, as if the world was ablaze. The intense hue seemed to consume everything in its path, casting an eerie glow over the chaos below. Maybe it was skyscrapers crumbling around me, huge chunks of concrete raining down like meteorites from a shattered heaven. The air was thick with smoke and the cacophony of screams, each one cutting through the tumultuous atmosphere like a knife. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a desperate plea for survival. I was running, dodging flames and debris, my breaths shallow and ragged, trying to keep up with a crowd of people who looked just as terrified as I did. Faces blurred by tears and fear, each person lost in their own nightmare, yet somehow united in this shared terror. Then I fell, and everything seemed to slow down. As I hit the ground, pain radiated through my body, but all I could focus on was the sight before me. A tank rolling up the street, the kind you see in movies, but adorned with real flags. Not American flags, but ones I'd only ever seen on the news. Chinese, Russian, and soldiers with hard faces and guns pointed directly at us. The sight was surreal, almost unbelievable. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the reality unfolding before my eyes. I remember thinking, this isn't happening. Not here, not in my country, but the buildings, the street signs. It was my city. I recognized them even through the choking smoke. They were broken and battered, yet unmistakably ours. And here they were, crawling with foreign soldiers and traitors fighting alongside the enemy. A profound sense of betrayal washed over me, a feeling that cut deeper than any physical wound. I didn't have time to think. My body just moved. I saw a family pinned down by rubble, and without a second thought, I ran toward them, shouting and waving my arms, desperate to save someone, anyone. The fear that had been paralyzing moments before transformed into a burning determination. Then, just like that, everything went black. But that was just the beginning. A fleeting glimpse of what I saw. The full vision revealed a warning for the year 2025 that we all need to pay attention to and listen to. I've heard all the jokes. Pastor Alex, the guy who's one sermon away from an aneurysm. I don't look like much of an athlete, I'll admit, but I'm still proud of my weekend biking routine. It's my therapy, clears my head, gives me time to reflect. Besides, I'm not that old. How do you so know me? That Saturday started out like any other. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft light over the town as I prepared for the day ahead. I had a big sermon coming up and wanted to talk about hope. How, no matter what's going on in the world, we're never truly alone. The usual pastor stuff, right? My congregation relied on these messages, finding solace and strength in the words I shared. So there I was, biking through the quiet back roads outside town, breathing in the fresh, early morning air. The scent of dew-covered grass and blooming flowers was invigorating, a stark contrast to the turmoil that would soon engulf my life. I remember coasting down this one long hill, feeling like I could fly. The wind whipped through my hair, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Maybe that's why I didn't notice the truck until it was too late. A flash of white, the screech of brakes, and then nothing. Time seemed to suspend itself, the world narrowing down to that split second of impact. I wish I could say I felt myself floating up or saw some big bright light like you hear in other near-death stories, but for me it was more like flicking a switch. 1 second I was on that hill, feeling the wind in my face, and the next, I was somewhere else entirely. At first, I thought it was just a bad dream. I was standing in the middle of a city, a big one like New York or Chicago, but it was oddly familiar. Landmarks were twisted and broken as if someone had taken the whole place and smashed it with a giant fist. The air was hot and thick, like standing next to a bonfire. People everywhere were running, screaming, crying. It was chaos, like every bad news report I'd ever seen, rolled into one nightmare. I tried to yell, tried to ask someone what was going on, but my voice got lost in the noise. I turned to Sarah. Then I saw them, soldiers marching in formation down the street. Only they weren't ours. They had foreign flags on their uniforms. Russian, Chinese, a few others I didn't recognize. Somehow, the sight of those flags made my stomach twist. The realization was horrifying. This wasn't some far-off war. This was here. This was next year. Our country torn apart, and somehow I was right in the middle of it all. Here's where things start to get really strange. The kind of strange that makes you question if you've lost your mind or if reality itself is turned upside down. 1 second I was in that crash, lying on the road under the sky above me. The next, I was somewhere else entirely, like I'd been plucked out of my world and set down in the middle of a disaster movie. The scene around me was sheer chaos, and people were running, panicked and desperate, through the streets of what I recognized as an American city. Which one I couldn't say. It was eerily familiar. But everything was shattered and torn apart. Storefronts were gutted. Buildings leaned as if they'd been beaten by some monstrous force. And smoke curled up from fires everywhere. As I tried to process it all, it felt like someone had turned the volume up to max. I could hear screams, shouts, and explosions in the distance. But above everything, there was a voice in my head, a deep, resonant knowing, telling me that this wasn't some distant war scene. No, this was happening here, on American soil, and it wasn't far off. This was 2025. As I stood there, frozen in shock, people were pushing past me, desperate to get away from something I didn't have time to ask about. My mind raced with questions. Who are these people? What do they want? But fear kept me silent, my body moving on autopilot. Then I caught sight of soldiers rounding the corner up ahead. They were in uniforms I didn't recognize, but their movements were calculated and confident. Whoever they were, they didn't look lost or confused. They were here on purpose, sweeping through like they owned the place. I remember the chilling realization that they weren't our soldiers. The flags on their shoulders were from places you'd never expect to see teaming up. Chinese insignias mixed with Russian patches and even symbols I'd seen in passing from Eastern European groups. It was a patchwork of different nations, all moving with a single purpose. In European uniform, which had direct blue patches, they had supporters too. People from right here, some in uniforms, others in plain clothes. Traders or sympathizers working right alongside them, guiding them like they'd been waiting for this moment. And, without even thinking, I started moving. Call it instinct, call it a vision, but I had this undeniable urge to follow a group of people who looked like they were searching for safety. I needed to find a way out, not just for myself, but for everyone around me. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me, heavier than any physical burden I had ever carried. Though I didn't yet know what I was supposed to do in the middle of all this, a fire ignited within me. A young girl caught my eye. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, standing there with tears streaking her face, searching the crowd. Her eyes were wide with fear, her small frame trembling as she tried to navigate the chaos. She looked so lost, so afraid, and I knew I had to help. I bent down and told her calmly that I'd keep her safe. It was a promise I didn't know if I could keep. But she looked at me, nodded, and held out her hand. I took it, feeling the weight of her trust, and we started moving together. Somehow I became part of a group that had gathered in an alleyway. Everyone was wide-eyed, whispering about what they'd heard. Stories of how this alliance had taken control of tech networks, communication lines, and even power grids. It didn't take tanks to break us down. They said it took control. We'd been cut off before most people even knew what was happening. An older man, a grizzled fellow with a bandana, nodded as if he'd seen this all coming. His eyes bore into mine with a mix of resignation and determination. He muttered about how the warnings had been there, how people had tried to sound the alarm about the ways we'd made ourselves vulnerable. As he spoke, a shiver ran down my spine. It hit me that this wasn't just a threat from the outside. It was an unraveling from within, something that had been building for years. The emotional toll of his words weighed heavily on me, a sobering reminder of how complacent we had become. We didn't have much time to chat, though. Suddenly, one of the group pointed out soldiers moving along the street, methodically sweeping from door to door. The woman beside me murmured something about how they were rounding people up, those who wouldn't fall in line. My gut told me we had to keep moving, but where? As we made our way through the alleys, I felt an unshakable urge to get these people to safety. I may have been confused and afraid, but somehow I'd become part of something bigger, something I couldn't abandon. Just as we ducked around a corner, we saw it. A massive armored vehicle rolling down the street, outfitted with what looked like surveillance equipment on top, slowly scanning and searching. It felt like it was looking straight through me, through all of us. My heart raced, and a surge of adrenaline propelled me forward. I grabbed the girl's hand tighter, feeling the warmth of her trust amidst the cold fears surrounding us. When you're in a situation like that, surrounded by fear and running on pure adrenaline, your senses heighten. You notice every sound, every shadow. Even though I'd been pulled into this vision from a quiet bike ride, it felt like I'd been there forever. Our group huddled close, sticking to the shadows as we navigated the back streets. The girl whose hand I was holding kept glancing up at me, her eyes big with fear and something else, maybe hope. She seemed to trust me, and that trust was like a weight on my shoulders. I had to keep her safe, no matter what. The responsibility was immense, but so was my determination to fulfill it. We moved down a narrow alley, dodging debris and broken glass, keeping our heads low. Every step felt like a gamble, each moment fraught with danger. Everyone was whispering, trading rumors. People were talking about what they had heard over hacked broadcasts and whispered warnings. The Alliance forces had already taken the coast, moving inward. Major cities were falling, but this wasn't a fast invasion. They'd been preparing for months, infiltrating systems and taking over critical infrastructure in ways that left the military scrambling. Our own soldiers were out of touch, paralyzed by the sheer speed and reach of the attack. It was hard to wrap my head around it, but the pieces started to make sense in the worst possible way. Just as we reached a break between buildings, the warning sound of drones filled the air. They flew low, sweeping the streets with bright lights that flickered through broken windows and across empty doorways. We all pressed up against the walls, holding our breath as they passed overhead. The mechanical hum was unnerving, a constant reminder of the ever-present threat. I could feel the little girl's heartbeat racing in her hand. Or maybe it was mine. One of the older men in our group muttered under his breath, talking about how technology had become our greatest vulnerability. He pointed out that these drones didn't even need human operators. They were automated, loaded with sensors and data, controlled remotely. It was as if they could read our every move. I realized with a sinking feeling that these weren't just random surveillance drones. They were hunting us, systematically sweeping for any signs of resistance. When the drones passed, we slipped further down the alley. The silence after the buzzing was almost worse, and I could feel everyone's nerves on edge. The tension was palpable, each person clutching onto their last shreds of hope and courage. Suddenly, we came across a checkpoint, a group of Alliance soldiers stationed right at the end of the street, blocking our path. They were armed to the teeth, their faces hidden behind masks, moving with the confidence of people who knew they were in control. Our group froze, unsure of what to do. I glanced around, desperate for a way out, when I noticed a narrow stairwell leading down into the basement of a nearby building. I nudged the others, motioning toward it, and we slowly slid down the stairs one by one. No. Inside it was pitch black, damp, and stank of mildew. The oppressive darkness seemed to swallow us whole, the silence thick and suffocating. We huddled together, listening to the muffled sounds of footsteps above us. Soldiers were moving slowly and methodically, as if they knew people were hiding close by. For a few heart-pounding minutes, I thought they'd find us, throw open the door, and drag us out one by one. The fear was paralyzing, but so was the determination to survive. But then, just as quickly as they'd come, their footsteps faded. The woman next to me exhaled shakily, and I realized I'd been holding my breath too. For a second, relief washed over us, and we dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd made it. But then we heard something that froze us in place. The faint sound of boots on the basement stairs. Panic shot through our group, but there was nowhere to go. The little girl looked up at me with wide eyes, and I knew I had to act. Without thinking, I motioned for everyone to follow me, slipping through a side door into what looked like an old utility room. It was cramped, filled with pipes and broken equipment, but it gave us cover. We ducked down, pressed against the walls as the soldiers moved through the basement. They were speaking in low voices, discussing orders and scanning the room with flashlights. I could barely understand them, but I caught enough to understand that they were looking for dissidents, people who had resisted. Desire to stop. It felt surreal listening to them talk about ordinary citizens as if they were criminals for wanting to protect their families. Again, at one point a soldier's flashlight beam fell right on us. My heart stopped as it hovered over our hiding spot. I braced myself, ready to shield the girl, ready for whatever came next. The world seemed to narrow down to that beam of light, my entire existence held in its glow. But just as quickly, the light moved on, and the footsteps faded. They hadn't seen us. After what felt like an eternity, the soldiers left, and the room fell silent again. We all let out a collective sigh of relief, but I could tell from the looks on everyone's faces that we were far from safe. We'd narrowly escaped this time, but the city was crawling with soldiers, drones, and who knew what else. Robert, the older man with the bandana, leaned in close and whispered about a resistance camp he'd heard of. A group hiding out in the industrial district, people fighting back. It wasn't much, but it was a glimmer of hope, a destination to hold on to. He suggested we try to make it there before daylight. Everyone was exhausted and scared, but that little spark of hope was enough to get us moving again. The weight of our journey ahead pressed down on us, but the promise of safety and resistance fueled our tired bodies. We left the basement as quietly as we could, slipping back into the dark streets. The night was our cloak, the shadows our allies. We made our way through the back alleys of the city, the weight of the world pressing down on all of us. The Resistance's underground base was surprisingly well hidden, like a forgotten corner of a once thriving place now reclaimed by those who refused to let everything fall apart. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched, like something big is about to happen. My mind raced with thoughts of loved ones, of the sermons I was meant to deliver, of the life I had left behind. Robert led the way, keeping his eyes peeled for any sign of trouble. His experience and calm demeanor were a beacon of stability in the chaos. Maya, the leader of this group, was all business. She didn't waste time with pleasantries, but gave us enough of the story to get us caught up on what we were walking into. The Alliance had been making its move for a while now, and their control was spreading fast. I couldn't help but notice how desperate everyone looked, yet they still had that fire in their eyes. They weren't defeated, not yet. But I knew that could change any second. In a way, that fire was all they had left. As we followed Maya through a maze of old industrial buildings, I couldn't help but wonder where I fit into all of this. I wasn't a fighter. I wasn't even really equipped for this kind of life, but I was here now, and I couldn't turn back. I'd seen too much, felt too much. People were relying on me, or at least they seemed to think I had something to offer. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. My role as a pastor had always been to guide and support, to offer hope and solace. Now, in the midst of destruction and fear, that role felt more crucial than ever. We finally made it to their hideout, a worn-down building with makeshift defenses, and people scattered everywhere, working together, planning, strategizing. It felt like the heart of something important, the kind of place where people either break or make something happen. The air was thick with tension and determination, each person contributing in their own way to the resistance effort. I was still trying to process everything when Maya brought us to a corner where a couple of people were plotting the next move. The world felt off, like it was out of focus for a second, but I shook it off. I had bigger things to focus on. I had no idea what I was doing here. I wasn't a resistance fighter, I was a pastor. But I had to believe that everything I'd seen, everything I'd been through, meant something. Maybe this was why I had been shown all those horrors. Maybe I was supposed to help these people, even if I didn't know how. But something inside me was starting to twist. The more I looked around, the more my mind drifted. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. One minute I was standing in a dark corner, listening to plans for some kind of attack, and the next, everything felt blurry, like I was slipping out of the vision, like the edges of reality were softening. For a brief second, I thought I saw something familiar, something from my real life. A glimpse of my old church, my congregation, A flash of my bike. What was that about? I shook it off. No time for that now. There were lives on the line. Damn it! Deep down, something inside me was starting to pull away, telling me this wasn't all real. Not in the way I thought it was. I couldn't make sense of it all. I knew I had to keep moving, but somewhere deep in my gut, I felt the pull back to reality. Something was happening, and it wasn't just the chaos around me. We'd been underground for what felt like days, moving through cramped tunnels and keeping our heads down. The resistance had a plan, but the longer I stayed in their world, the less sure I was of our chances. Every piece of information seemed to be another piece in a puzzle that was becoming more and more incomprehensible. There was no clear path forward. It wasn't just a war against an enemy. It was a war against everything that had once been solid. When we finally merged into daylight, everything felt different. The streets were still eerily empty, but the weight in the air felt heavier, like a storm was waiting to break. It wasn't just the absence of people, it was the absence of hope. Maya had led us to the top of a building, and I stood at the edge, looking out over a city that had been torn apart. Fires burned in the distance, and the air tasted like smoke. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't just a battle, it was an all-out war, a fight for the very soul of our nation. My heart ached with the weight of what was to come. A future that seemed bleak and uncertain. I had a sudden, sickening realization that we weren't going to stop this. Not today, not ever. The forces at play here were too big, too relentless, and we were small, barely a blip in the grand scheme of it. The hopelessness settled over me like a dark cloud, threatening to consume the last remnants of my strength. All I looked down at was my hands, trembling with fear and exhaustion. And that's when the world seemed to bend. Everything flickered like a television screen glitching, and for a split second, I was no longer standing on the rooftop. I was back on the bike, the wind in my face, riding down a familiar road in the country. The smell of fresh air replaced the smoke, and the warmth of the sun felt soothing against my skin. My heart pounded, but it was different now. It was panic, not adrenaline. My surroundings shifted again, the world flickering like a broken light bulb, and I was suddenly thrust back into the chaos, the fight, the fires, the soldiers everywhere, the sounds of gunfire and screams. It was overwhelming. But I wasn't just witnessing it. I was in the middle of it. Running through the streets, trying to help people, pulling them out of the wreckage. I didn't even know who they were, but I couldn't ignore the cries for help. Every person I saved felt like a tiny victory, but it never seemed to be enough. The desperation in their eyes mirrored my own, a shared understanding of the dire situation we were all in. And then everything changed. The vision, the war, the chaos, the destruction started to pull away. The world was fading like a dream you can't hold on to, no matter how hard you try. The noise of the car horn, the screech of the tires, the distant sound of a crash, all of it blended together in a fading blur. I remember feeling my body jerk, like I was being pulled away from the bike, from the road, from everything. But just as quickly as the pull came, it stopped. I felt something, a sharp pain in my chest. But it wasn't from a crash, at least not one that felt real. It was a pressure, like a weight on my ribs, a reminder that something wasn't right. Then I gasped. I was breathing again, for real this time, not in the vision anymore. The pain in my chest didn't make sense. I wasn't sure if it was real or if it was just a remnant of the vision I had just lived through. I couldn't be sure if I had actually been hit by a car in the real world or if that was just a part of the nightmare I had been trapped in. But as my breath slowed and the world around me began to clear, one thing became certain. I was awake, or at least I thought I was. I didn't know if I had actually died or if I had been hit by a car in the real world, but I knew I wasn't in the middle of a war anymore. I wasn't holding people in the streets or trying to outrun enemy fire. I was back in a place that felt real. But was it? The weight of the experience still clung to me as I sat there on the bike, trying to steady myself. My hands shook, not from physical exertion, but from the emotional turmoil that churned inside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The vision wasn't just a dream, it was a warning. The world I had witnessed, that world was coming, and I was powerless to stop it. My mind raced with questions and fears, each one more unsettling than the last. The air around me felt different, heavier, as if laden with unseen forces. There was no going back to what I had known. The past, the present, it was all slipping away. Something else was here now, something I had no control over, and I couldn't ignore it. I rode on, the wind in my face, but I couldn't forget what I had seen. The faces of the terrified people, the sight of the foreign soldiers, the desperate hope in the little girl's eyes. It all haunted me, and I knew I wasn't ready for what was coming. The burden of the vision pressed down on me, intertwining with my role as a pastor. How could I guide others when I was grappling with my own fears and uncertainties? As a pastor, I've always preached about hope and resilience. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of that day. The thin line between life and death, between reality and a haunting vision. Whether it was a genuine near-death experience or a vivid hallucination, the message remains clear. We must heed the warnings, stay vigilant, and hold on to hope, even in the darkest times. The future is uncertain, but with faith and unity, perhaps we can navigate whatever lies ahead.